rights come from. By the winter of 1945, 2 world wars had been fought within a span of less than 30 years, and cruelty almost beyond belief had been unleashed on members of the Jewish race and on prisoners of war in Asia and Europe. In the summer of that same year, an atomic bomb would be set off that would show just how enormous a destructive power humankind could unleash. It was clear that the world was in a state of peril. Post-World War II, in response to the events that had just taken place, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights was written by the United Nations. Article 3 of the document states, "Everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of the persons," where everyone in the document refers to all members of the human species as referred to in the preamble. Now, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has come to be known as the gold standard on human rights, and its contents have been echoed in other documents, such as the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the Declaration of the Rights of the Child. Human rights are necessary because we need these safeguards to protect humans of all races, religions, and classes from atrocities that have happened in our past. We recognize the need for human rights because we've seen the horror that takes place when they don't exist. Human rights violations, injustices of mass proportions are the result. It's human rights that allow us to create a vision of what the world would be like if everyone's humanity was equally respected and protected. It's human rights that we can use as a standard when formulating social and political change that encourages justice and fairness within our societies. And it's human rights that we need for our protection when our legal rights are violated by the state. Now, I'm here to talk to you tonight about perhaps one of the most controversial issues in modern society, abortion. But is abortion really at the core of this polarizing debate, or is it something else? After all, if abortion didn't involve the termination of a human being, then the debate would cease to exist entirely, or at least be severely diminished. It seems much more fitting to say that our disagreement on the issue doesn't stem over abortion, but rather over the nature of the being whose life abortion terminates. The central question then comes down to this: at what point do we become human? And at what point do human beings deserve human rights? The case I will be making tonight is that abortion is an unethical act and a human rights violation. And I will do so by first proving that the humanity of preborn children and their personhood, and then we will talk about abortion and the procedure and what it does. Now, just the other day I was talking with a student here at Western University who hadn't really given the issue of abortion much thought. And so I asked him, "Do you believe in human rights?" To which he agreed, and so I asked him who he thought should deserve human rights. "Well, everyone," he said. I agreed, and I asked him, if 2 human beings reproduce, what would the species of their offspring be? And at this point he kind of looked at me funny, and so I clarified and said, well, can a human and a human reproduce and their offspring be a dog or a cat? Or would the offspring of 2 human beings also be a human? Well, he agreed that, humans must reproduce humans as well. And so I then asked him, if something is growing and developing, must it not also be alive? By this point in our conversation, this student and I had agreed on 3 things. We first agreed that all human beings deserve human rights. We agreed that humans must reproduce other humans. And we agreed that if something's growing and developing, it must be alive. And so I said, since you and I agree that preborn children are human and living, wouldn't it logically follow that an act that terminates the life of that preborn child would be a violation of his or her human rights? Now, lots of the time when I talk to students here on campus, looking at the abortion issue through the lens of human rights and asking the questions that I just presented to you that are collectively known as the human rights argument are enough to make a convincing case against abortion. but sometimes students are hesitant to accept the pro-life position, and usually their concerns relate back to the question that I believe is at the core of the argument, and that is, at what point does human life begin? Keith Moore's Embryology textbook, which is used in medical schools across the country, such as UBC, states the following. Human life begins at fertilization, the process during which a male gamete or sperm unites with a female gamete or oocyte to form a single cell called a zygote. This highly specialized totipotent cell marked the beginning of each of us as a unique individual. So the question here is not whether or not preborn children are members of the human family, because the science and embryology is clear on that. Now we can further confirm this by looking at how scientists distinguish cell types. Scientists now, to distinguish two different types of cells, use two types of criteria, and that's composition and behavior, or in other words, what a cell is made up of and what a cell does. By examining these two criteria, we see that at the moment of fertilization, or in other words, spermic fusion, we are dealing with a cell that is fundamentally different than the cells we were dealing with prior to that spermic fusion. The composition of gametes or sex cells is haploid, meaning they contain half the genetic information of a somatic or body cell. Now, the behavior of a sperm, what it does is penetrate the egg, and the behavior of the egg is to be penetrated. Now, but the single-celled zygote that forms at the time of spermic fusion during fertilization has a different composition and behavior. An embryo is diploid, meaning it contains all the genetic information necessary and codes for everything from hair to eye color and other genetic traits. Further, an embryo's behavior is no longer to penetrate or to be penetrated, but rather it's to rapidly grow and rapidly proliferate in a really short time span. These differences provide further evidence that fertilization marks the beginning of a new human life, which has unique DNA different from all other humans in the world. Now, the other day, I was speaking with a girl who didn't seem to have a problem with abortion because she was adamant that human life didn't begin until birth. And so I asked her, can we agree that human life must begin at least at one of the following three stages? Either human life begins sometime before fertilization, at the moment of fertilization, or sometime after fertilization. She agreed, and so I asked, can a sperm left alone in a man's body, or an egg left alone in my body, ever develop into a fully functioning adult like you and me? Well, of course not, she said, and I agreed. So we were able to rule out that human life doesn't begin at some point before fertilization. I then asked her, if you saw a 1-year-old girl named Ava playing in the playground, would you assume that she just popped out of thin air and that her life began at 1 year old? And she kind of giggled at this point and agreed that that's not possible. And so we were able to conclude that Ava must have developed from a younger version of herself. Ava was once a newborn, a fetus, and an embryo. And so if we know that human beings don't just assemble themselves in a woman's birth canal, we can trace their development all the way back to the moment that they came into existence, fertilization. Now, there are many differences between 1-year-old Ava as a toddler compared to a newborn, a fetus, and a zygote. There's a difference in size. There's a difference in physical and intellectual development. There's a difference in their environment. I mean, an embryo finds itself in a fallopian tube, but then a uterus, and eventually it exits their mother's womb. And finally, there's a difference in the degree of dependency, whereas early on in the stages of pregnancy, a child is completely dependent on his or her mother's body for survival, and as they grow older, that dependency decreases. The question is, are these differences relevant when it comes to our right to life, or when it comes to our personhood? I'll ask you to think about that for a moment. What constitutes a person? I pose this question to students a lot, and the answers I get vary significantly. Some people may say that a person is someone who is sentient, who has the ability to perceive and to feel things like pain. But what about Gabby Gingras, a 17-year-old girl who was born lacking the ability to feel pain, to the point that when she was a child, she would chew her fingers until they bled, and eventually she had to have her left eye removed because she unknowingly scratched at it so severely? Would we ever say that Gabby isn't a person because she can't feel pain? Others might say that a person is someone who has arms and legs. But what about Nick Vujicic, a man who was born with a severe genetic disorder characterized by a lack of limbs? Nick, who is now an international motivational speaker, was able to persevere and adapt and is able to do things today like go swimming and diving. Would we ever say that Nick isn't a person? Others may say that a person is someone who can talk and think. But let's think back to 1-year-old Ava. Ava can't communicate the way we can as adults, and Ava also can't think to the degree that you and I can. But does her age, does how young she is, mean that she isn't a person? Should our personhood and our right to life be based on subjective criteria, or should it be based on our membership in the human family? If I ask you to consider the time from birth to adulthood and the changes that take place within that time period, you'd probably tell me that your size increases quite a bit, that your physical and intellectual development has increased, your environment is constantly changing, and so is your dependency. So if we wouldn't deny a born individual her personhood status because she differs from adults in these ways, neither then should we deny the preborn their personhood status simply because they differ from us in those same ways. Our differences are not a reflection of who we are or what we are, but rather of how old we are. What is consistent among all of us, as all these things are inconsistent, is our human nature and our membership in the human family. Going back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that I introduced earlier, the use of the term human in this document is very crucial, because the term human is an objective term that can be proved scientifically. The term person, however, is a legal term that's definition has changed throughout human history. The language of personhood is the language of discrimination. History has shown terrifying consequences when more than basic humanity and membership in the human family is required for individual rights. Arbitrary, subjective claims to humanity are always problematic, and amid the most disturbing human rights violations in history, the idea of human plus X has been propagated. The term persons, at one point, for example, was used to deny women their personhood status, because during that time to be a person was to be human plus male. In the 1800s, the term person was used to discriminate against people of color, because to be a person was to be human plus white. During the time of Hitler's Germany, Jewish people were not considered persons under the law, because during that time to be considered a person was to be human plus Aryan. When societies deny personhood based on a quality that some of its members have but not all, inevitably some humans get left out. Whether it be the groups of people that I just mentioned from our historical past, or people like Gabby who can't feel pain, or people like Nick who don't have limbs, or even people like Eva who are simply just too young and not developed enough. When we pick an ability, someone always gets left out. But if we acknowledge our personhood and our right to life based on our membership in the human family, then everyone is safe. Because the only thing that we all have in common is our humanity, is our human nature. So I've now made the case for the personhood and the humanity of preborn children by answering the question of when human life begins. But what about the act of abortion? By definition, abortion is the intentional and direct killing of a preborn child. And since preborn children are human and living just like you and me, then wouldn't it logically follow that an act that ends his or her life will be a violation of that human's rights? But I think that in order to have an intellectually honest conversation about the act of abortion, we need to be able to honestly examine the facts of what abortion is and what abortion does. So on that note, I'm going to briefly show you the photographic evidence of what abortion does to preborn children.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men
You can choose to look the other way, but you can never again say that you did not know. Those were the exact words of social reformer and abolitionist William Wilberforce, who during his time eradicated the British slave trade from Great Britain. Now, William Wilberforce lived alongside the injustice of the slave trade, and once he saw what was going on in his society, he decided that he couldn't stay silent. And so what he did was he took the injustice of his time and he exposed it for what it was. He took diagrams of the slave ships and pictures of the inhuman ways that the Africans were being treated, and he made them visible. He put them out in the public sphere, in places in the streets, even in the pubs. He took the shackles and the whips that were used to torture the African slaves, and he brought them into Parliament for all to see. Now, this image of the slave ship Brooks was one of the most iconic images that William Wilberforce showed. Now, back then, this image, although it may not look graphic, particularly graphic today, was so horrific that it wasn't shown to people of old age for fear that they would have a heart attack and die. Now, the reason Wilberforce showed these images, and the reason I showed you the evidence of what abortion does to preborn children, is because injustice that is invisible inevitably becomes tolerable. But injustice that is made visible inevitably becomes intolerable. In a span of his lifetime, William Wilberforce witnessed the injustice and human rights violation of the slave trade, but he got to also see the day that it was eradicated from Great Britain. Now fast forward to today, and we continue to live in a time alongside a human rights violation of mass proportions. In Canada, every single day, nearly 300 preborn children are aborted. And only in Canada, China, and North Korea can a woman have an abortion through all 9 months of pregnancy up until the moment before that child is ready to be born. When faced with a human rights violation of such mass proportions, how can we not expose the injustice inflicted upon the youngest members of our society, too weak to even stand up and defend their own lives? Now, when I first became a pro-life human rights advocate, one of the very first people I talked to while doing outreach was a man in his late 40s. And although it was 2 years ago, I clearly remember him coming up to me and telling me how him and his wife had chosen to have an abortion 12 years ago and how they regretted it ever since. I vividly remember him crying in front of me and telling me how much he regrets the decision and how his wife has never been the same because of that decision. And looking at the sign, at the image of the preborn child that had fallen victim to abortion that was depicted on my sign that day, I'll never forget him saying, "If only I knew what abortion does to a child, to my child, I would have never have gone through with that." Now that child would have been 12 years old this year. And while I've showed you what happens to preborn children when we don't expose the injustice and we don't reach them in time, I also now want to show you what happens when we do. Now, one of my friends and colleagues, Kiana, was doing pro-life outreach with me in the summer of 2015, and she was standing in a public sphere holding a sign of images similar to what you saw in that video when a young woman and her boyfriend happened to walk by. And as they walked by, the boyfriend turned to his girlfriend and said, "Hey, that's what you're scheduled to do this Thursday." Now, Kiana was able to have a conversation with that woman, and a few weeks later, I received this ultrasound image. Now, fast forward a few months after that, and after months of communication and support, I received an image of this little girl who was born to that young woman that had seen what abortion would do to her child. Now, remember earlier tonight when I brought up 1-year-old Ava playing in the playground? Well, that girl, that baby Ava, was the girl you just saw in that image. This is Ava today. She's a year old, she's alive, she's healthy, and she's beautiful. And this is the product, this is what happens when someone is able to have a simple conversation and is able to expose the injustice of what abortion would have done to her. So while we know that many preborn children end up looking like the images you saw in that video, we also know from the outreach that has been done that there are many children that end up looking like Ava. And they're alive because injustice that has been happening day in and day out in this country has been able to be exposed. Now, I've made the case for the personhood and the humanity of the preborn child, and I've shown you that abortion is an act that terminates that developing child's life. Now, today, there's an increasing number of young people who accept the pro-life position and reject abortion because they've been able to recognize that it is indeed an unethical act and a human rights violation. And what I would like to urge you to do tonight is invite you to accept the same. Thank you.
Thank you guys so much. Sorry about the technical difficulties at the beginning again. We'll be having a Q&A after our next presentation, so hold on to your questions. They'll be coming up soon. We're just going to get this presentation set up, so if you want to use the washroom or anything like that, you can go now.